Good morning, everyone. I am Mr. Fuller, and I want to talk to you today about changes. This season of rapidly changing weather, in the midst of a school year that is very different from previous school years, reminds me of another change that once occurred in history. We would consider it a small one, and yet for the people who lived that daily life, it was very significant. I doubt this change will ever happen again in at least most parts of the modern world, and I certainly hope I don't have to go through it. I am referring to September 3rd, 1967, H-Day, the day that Swedes stopped driving on the left side of the road and started driving on the right. Historically, people drove, walked, or rode their horses on whatever side of the road was most convenient. However, since most people historically have been right-handed, there was a slight preference among mounted troops to ride on the left-hand side, allowing their sword arm a better range of motion. But in reality, road customs varied like any other custom from place to place. And with the invention of the automobile simply followed the dominant customs that already existed in most places. Hence, in Sweden, people tended to drive on the right. In their Scandinavian neighbors, Norway, Finland, Denmark, people drove on the right side of the road. Now, that might not have been a problem when a Finnish farmer rode his wagon of produce into neighboring Sweden. However, as automobiles became more common, and the combination of automobiles that could go at increasing speeds, travel greater distances, and travel into new countries that might not have been reached before, those factors brought about the situation where suddenly a lot more people found themselves in strange driving situations and in places where they were not used to driving. And in fact, they might find themselves on the wrong side of the road. A further complication was that Swedish automobile manufacturers made cars designed for left-handed driving and right-handed driving. Left-handed vehicles for the left-handed domestic market and certain foreign markets like Japan or Australia that drive on the left, or even, say, a postal service truck. And then right-handed vehicles for export to the rest of the world. So your Volvo made in Sweden in 1960 and exported to America would have right-handed steering. The same car sold in Sweden would have left-handed steering. However, some cars got mixed up and you would have cars designed for the right being driven in Sweden, or a Norwegian car with right-hand steering being driven into left-handed Sweden. Hence, you can see how all of these circumstances could create a lot of confusion and potential for error. Now, driving, like most things in life, is a habit that one gets used to. And as a habit, it is very difficult to change. And of course, drivers entering Sweden from countries that drove on the right found themselves very confused, disoriented, and stressed by the fact that people were suddenly driving on the left side of the road. And the Swedes felt the same way when they traveled to other parts of Europe. This problem grew especially acute after World War II, as the increasing popularity of the automobile and the decolonization of European powers from Africa and Asia meant that more and more countries found themselves with automobiles, and in some cases, neighbors that drove on the other side of the world. British Africa and German Africa, for instance, drove on different sides of the road. When those countries became separate colonies and eventually their own countries, they started to switch so as to standardize and not have to be driving into neighbors with different expectations. Finally, in the 60s, Sweden decided that this was probably a good idea, and the government put it to a vote. 83% of Swedes voted against switching the direction that they drove on. And the Swedish government, after carefully considering the results of this democratic vote, decided to go ahead and make the switch anyway. They put together massive government departments to prepare, plan, and figure out how do we switch a nation of 8 million people from driving on one side of the road to the other. So I invite you to think of all the things, mostly infrastructure, but other things as well, that would need to be updated if we were to switch the side of the road that we drove on. Traffic signs would have to be flipped. Stop signs would have to be moved to the opposite sides of the street. On-ramps would become off-ramps, and off-ramps would become on-ramps. There are all sorts of these obvious things, and then also less obvious ones. What about passengers getting off a bus? We don't want them entering the middle of the traffic, do we? We want them exiting the curb. What about drive-through lanes at the bank or the McDonald's? There are all of these details that the government had to consider, and perhaps the biggest detail of all was the people. How do we get the people themselves to make this switch and make it smoothly and without the problems, the many problems that could happen? Now, we should say the government groups did a great job. They thought through nearly everything. They thought through the infrastructure, the signs, the practical aspects, the timing, and they thought through how do we convince Swedes to do something which seems fundamentally to them unsafe. If your habit has been to drive on the left side, driving on the right side of the road screams unsafe behavior to you. And so, of course, you're not going to do that. Well, the Swedish government had to figure out a way to make this work. So they put together pamphlets explaining all the rules, explaining how every little part of driving will be different, explaining the expectations for cars, for taxis, for buses, for pedestrians, for bicycles. They put all this information out there. There was a rock song commissioned encouraging people to drive on the right, reminding them, drive on the right, stay on the right. There were newspaper ads, there were TV ads, there were radio ads, and there was an icon, a logo designed showing the switch, H, right, that was going to be plastered all over Sweden in time for the switch, to remind people afterwards that they were supposed to be driving on the right side of the road. Now, perhaps the biggest challenge was picking a day to finalize the switch. H Day was finally set as September 3rd, 1967. As the date drew closer, the media blitz intensified. Finally, the evening of September 2nd arrived. Traffic was banned for all but the most emergency purposes. Road crews worked desperately overnight to switch signs, to reconfigure intersections that had not been touched already, to make the nation ready for driving on the right side of the road. In a certain sense, the evening was lawless, as signs gave one direction and the rules might be pointing towards another direction. And so people were mostly off the streets, thankfully. The few people who were out and about, perhaps on a bicycle or reporting, said it was this very strange, eerie scene. There was almost total freedom with the lack of traffic, and it was very enjoyable in some ways, even though they knew that it was getting them ready for a major switch. Now, think about how many signs are in Colorado Springs. The street crews were working to change all of the signs overnight. Even just changing all of the signs in Colorado Springs sounds like a momentous effort. So I cannot imagine how they even planned to do this in 6 to 10 hours of one day. And yet somehow, amazingly, they did. Now, in the very early morning, as the work was being finished, traffic cops descended into the streets in preparation for the morning commute. Thousands of traffic cops were going to direct traffic in ways that they had never directed it before. At 4:50 a.m., right before the morning rush hour officially started, the signal was given in Stockholm to switch over. And somehow, miraculously, people started driving on the right side of the road. There was accidents, there was confusion, there was anger even at the fact that the government had gone ahead and made this switch when the people had voted against it. But on the whole, people were very careful. People had been prepared. People were afraid, and as such, they drove very cautiously. There were no fatalities that day from traffic accidents. Complete traffic accident fatality-free day. There were accidents, there were fender benders, there were minor scrapes, but people were being so careful that they avoided major accidents that could have resulted in death. The accident rate remained low for several months as people slowly readjusted themselves back to this normal driving routine, even though it was the complete opposite of what they had done before. Now, once the changes were actually implemented, it took a while to get a hold of, but frankly, within 6 months, most people barely even thought about it or noticed that they were driving different than the way they had before. The fact that an entire nation could make this change overnight strikes me as a testament to both the incredible power of human habit and our power to modify and adapt it, especially with proper notice and preparation. In a year where normal activities have been affected by forces outside of our control and things seem continually to be changing and spiraling in ways, it is useful to remember both how flexible we are and how quickly things can change in good ways and in bad. And so I encourage you, go forth, be flexible, develop good habits, and when change comes, develop better ones and adapt. Thank you.